What do you call a people whose word for themselves was lost? You are looking at a clay tablet. It is small enough to fit in a palm. The marks on its surface were pressed into wet clay by a reed more than 3,500 years ago. They are counts of saffron, tallies of wool, lists of oil. We can read the numbers. We cannot read a single word. The hand that pressed these signs had a name for itself. We do not know it. You are standing in a low-ceilinged room in the basement of a palace. The room has no name in any language you speak. The walls are cool. The air smells faintly of damp limestone and of olive oil that has been stored for a long time in clay. On a wooden table in front of you there is a stack of small tablets, none of them larger than your hand. They are still soft. The scribe who pressed these signs has only just stepped away. In a few hours, in a few days, in a few decades, a fire will sweep through this room. The tablets will bake, the wood will burn, the roof will fall, and the marks on the clay, hardened by the heat that destroyed the building around them, will be all that survives. That fire is the only reason you know any of this. The tablets we have were never meant to last. They were the working memory of an administration, kept soft so the signs could be smoothed out and replaced. The scribes did not write to be remembered. They wrote to count. The fire that ended their world preserved the record of it, and the record of it is the list of jars of oil now under your eyes. You call them the Minoans. That word is not theirs. It was invented in the first year of the 20th century by a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans, who had bought a hillside on the island of Crete and begun to dig. He named them after King Minos, a figure from Greek myth, a king of the labyrinth, the husband of the woman who gave birth to the Minotaur. The myth was 1,000 years younger than the people Evans was uncovering. The name was a guess. It stuck. You have been calling them by it ever since. The script the scribes used is called Linear A. It appears in the archaeological record around 1800 years before the Common Era and disappears around 1450. For 6.5 centuries, the people of Crete pressed these signs into wet clay to manage the flow of goods through their palaces. There are at least 90 different characters in front of you. They form a syllabary, which is to say each sign almost certainly stands for a sound, not a thing. Scholars have been trying to read Linear A for more than 120 years. No one has succeeded. The native language of Bronze Age Crete is, at this moment, completely unknown to you. It is worth saying clearly what this means. It does not mean that we have a few fragments. It does not mean that we are close. It means that we have the receipts of a civilization, in the civilization's own writing, and we cannot tell you what a single word of it sounds like. We do not know what they called their gods. We do not know what they called their kings, if they had kings. We do not know what they called the sea, which surrounded them on every side, which was their wall and their road, and, in the end, the thing that came for them. We will come back to the day the sea came. But first you should know what is in the rest of the room. You are standing now in front of a glass case. The case is in a museum in the city of Heracleion, on the northern coast of Crete, a few minutes' drive from the hill where Evans dug. Inside the case there is a small gold pendant. It is roughly the size of a coin. It shows 2 bees, facing each other, their wings folded back, their legs cupping a small round drop of honey held between them. The gold is worked in granulation so fine it looks like a sprinkling of dew. It was made nearly 4,000 years ago. The hands that made it could see what your eyes can barely follow. The bees are perfect. You move to the next case. There is a tall ceramic jar, the height of a young child, Around its body, in deep blue paint on a pale ground, an octopus uncoils. Its 8 arms wrap the curve of the vessel. Its eye is alert. The painter understood the animal. The painter had watched it move in water. There is no sense, anywhere on the jar, that the painter felt the need to flatten or stylize what they had seen. The octopus is moving. The pot is alive. You move again. The walls of this gallery hold fragments of fresco. The fragments have been mounted on plaster, and the missing portions filled in with neutral tones, so that what survives is held in the geometry of what was lost. Faces look out at you. They are painted in profile. The eyes are large and dark and rimmed in black. The hair is black and falls in long curling locks. The skin tones differ from face to face by an old Egyptian convention that the painters of Crete also used, in which women are shown with paler skin and men with reddish brown. The faces are not smiling. They are not frowning. They are watching. They have been watching for 3,500 years. What do you call a civilization that left us everything except its name? What do you do with a history that is mostly an absence? The shape of the absence is what we are going to spend the rest of this story tracing. They built palaces without walls. They worshipped on the tops of mountains, in shrines above the clouds, with no roofs over their heads. They sent ships south to the river delta of Egypt and brought back ivory and gold. Their pottery has been found in tombs along the Nile. Their frescoes have been found on the walls of Egyptian palaces. Tin from the mountains of Afghanistan was crossing half the known world to reach their bronze smiths. And then, somewhere in the 17th century before the Common Era, the sea began to move against them, not all at once, in stages, each stage darker than the last. By 1100 years before the Common Era, the people who had once painted the walls in the blue of the Aegean afternoon were living in stone hovels on a cold mountain plateau. More than 1,000 meters above the coastlines they had abandoned, the palace world was 3 centuries gone. The language was on its way to silence, and no one outside Crete knew anything about them at all. You will not hear them speak in this story. No one will. That is the shape of the silence we are working with, but you will see them. You will stand in their storerooms and watch the lamp flame move across the pithoi. You will walk into the painted halls of Knossos when the color was still fresh on the walls. You will be standing on the northern coast of Crete on the morning the sky went dark. And, in the end, you will stand on a windy ridge above the Lassithi plain and watch a woman raise her arms in a gesture that no one had taught her, because there was no one left to teach her, but that she remembered because her grandmother had remembered, because the gesture itself had survived the things that did not. To understand what was lost, you have to start before the palaces, long before. You are standing now on a Neolithic island at the edge of the world the Bronze Age would soon know, where the first people who would become the Minoans are already, quietly, doing the work of becoming. You are looking at a long island shaped like a fish, the head turned east, the tail flung west. It is just over 250 kilometers from end to end, and at no point along its length is it much more than 50 kilometers wide. The northern coast in front of you looks out across a stretch of open water towards the Cyclades, and, beyond them, the southern coast of mainland Greece. If you turn south, you face a wider sea towards the long curve of the North African shore, and the river delta of Egypt lies almost due south. To the east, beyond the small islands at the tip of the fish's tail, lies the long coastline of Anatolia, and behind that, the Levant. To the west, the open sea runs out towards Sicily and the deep Mediterranean. You are at a crossroads. Crete sits where three worlds meet. It has, from the beginning, faced outward. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, the people on the slopes below you are already farmers. They have been farmers for a very long time. The first villages had been planted on the island as early as the 7th millennium by people crossing in small boats from Anatolia, bringing seed and goats and the knowledge of how to bake bread. By the 4th millennium, those villages have grown. The settlements are clustered in the fertile plains and along the river valleys. Olive trees are already in cultivation. Grapes are pressed into wine. The harbours of the north coast below you are sending small craft out across the water, and obsidian, the dark volcanic glass from the small island of Melos in the central Aegean, is moving south into Crete, where the obsidian itself does not exist. Cretan boats are crossing to Melos and back. The island you are standing on is not isolated. It has never been isolated. The sea is already a road. You walk inland. By 2,600 years before the Common Era, the small towns you pass through are beginning to look different from the villages around them. Some of the burials in the round tombs of the Messara plain are starting to contain things you would not have seen a few generations earlier. Imported daggers, small gold ornaments, seals of imported stone. The wealth is unevenly distributed. Someone is gathering it. Someone is being buried with more honor than their neighbors. We do not know what they were called. We do not know how their authority was named, but the shape of the gathering is becoming visible in the ground beneath your feet. And then, somewhere around 2,000 years before the Common Era, something happens for which we have no obvious precedent on the island. The first palaces appear. You can see them now from where you stand. They appear at 4 sites, more or less at once. Knossos, in the north, on the low hills above what is now the Bay of Heraklion. Phaistos, in the south, looking out over the wide Messara plain. Malia, further east along the northern coast. Zakros, at the far eastern edge of the island, on a small bay opening towards the Levant. Other smaller centres rise alongside them. Galatas, Petras. Gornia is a town, not a palace, but it grows in this same wave. You walk towards the nearest of them. The first palaces are large. They are organized. They have central courtyards, paved in stone, around which rooms cluster in tight arrangements. You pass wings dedicated to storage, with rooms full of those enormous storage jars you have already seen in the basement, the pithoi, taller than a person, set in rows along the magazines. You pass workshops where craftsmen produce pottery, metalwork, faience. You pass shrines. You pass what appear to be ceremonial halls. And there is something else, something which, the longer you sit with it, the stranger it becomes. There are no walls. You can walk right in. There are no fortifications. There are no towers. There are no defensive ditches around them. There is nothing along the approach that suggests the palace expected to defend itself against an attack from any direction at all. The buildings open outward into the landscape. You walk into them. A child could walk into them. This is, in the world of the Bronze Age, almost unheard of. Look across the water for a moment. On the Greek mainland, where the Mycenaean citadels will rise some centuries later, the palaces will be set behind enormous cyclopean walls, built of stone so large that later Greeks would say only one-eyed giants could have lifted them. In the cities of Mesopotamia, walls are the first thing you build. In the kingdoms of the Levant, walls are the proof that the king is a king. In Egypt, the desert itself is the wall, and the palace is set far behind it. Everywhere a complex society arises in the Bronze Age, the first thing it builds is a wall. Except here, on the island under your feet. What does this mean? We do not entirely know. Some scholars argue that the sea itself was the wall, that the navy of Crete was so dominant in this part of the Mediterranean that no foreign power could reach the palaces with a landing force large enough to threaten them. There may be truth in this. The Greek historian Thucydides, writing nearly 1500 years later, would say that King Minos was the first man to organize a navy, to rule the sea, to put down piracy. He thought of it as a memory. He may have been right. Others argue that the absence of walls says something different, something internal. It suggests that whatever held this society together did not depend, in the way the societies around it did, on the constant threat of organized violence. It suggests an authority of a different kind, religious, perhaps, ceremonial, tied to the redistribution of goods rather than to the imposition of force. The palace, in this reading, is not a fortress but a granary, a temple, a counting house. It is where the wool comes in to be redistributed and the oil goes out to be exchanged. It works because people bring their grain to it. They bring their grain because it is sacred to bring it. The sacred is the wall. Both readings may be true. The truth in this period is almost always made of more than one thing at once. What is certain is that for 200 years, between about 2000 and 1700 years before the Common Era, the palaces stood and the system worked. Goods flowed in, goods flowed out. The script we now call Cretan hieroglyphic appears on the seals that the administrators used to mark the necks of jars and the wax of bundles. It is the older cousin of Linear A, and, like Linear A, it has never been read. The first writing of Europe is a writing we cannot speak. You are standing now in one of the storerooms of the first palace at Knossos. The walls are of cut stone, fitted together without mortar. The ceiling beams are of cypress, dark, with the smoke of small oil lamps. The smell of olive oil is everywhere, the faint, sweet, sour smell of oil that has been kept too long, mixed with the dustier smell of grain. Along the walls, the pithoi stand in rows, taller than you are. The largest are big enough that a child could climb inside one and disappear. The shoulders of the jars are decorated with raised bands of clay that the potter has pinched into rope patterns and rosettes. The lids are heavy stone. On each lid, a small clay ceiling has been pressed and stamped with the mark of the official responsible for the jar. The mark cannot be read in any language alive on earth. The mark was unambiguous to the people who used it. They knew exactly whose oil this was. You are listening to the hum of bureaucracy in a world that has not yet invented the word for it. The scribes move past you between the rooms with their soft tablets and their reed pens. The runners come in from the harbour with new amphorae. The lampblack of the small flames stains the cypress above your head. Outside, the central court of the palace lies empty, paved in worn stone, waiting for the festivals that will fill it later in the year. And somewhere, in a small inner room that you cannot reach, the senior administrators are doing the work that holds the whole island together, which is, in the end, the work of remembering who owes what to whom. Then, around 1700 years before the Common Era, an earthquake comes. You feel it through the soles of your feet first. It is one of the great earthquakes of the Aegean, the kind that the island sees once or twice in a millennium. The first palaces are destroyed, walls fall around you, roofs collapse, fire breaks out in the storerooms, where the oil pours from broken jars onto burning lamps. The damage is general and severe. At several sites, the destruction is total. The people do not leave. This is the thing about the Minoans that we will see again and again until the very end. They are tied to the place. They build, they fall, they rebuild. Within a generation, the palaces are going up again, on the same ground, on top of the rubble of the old ones, and they are going up larger than before. The plans become more refined, the storerooms become deeper. The frescoes that had begun modestly on a few walls in the first period begin to spread. The color palette of the painters widens. The wealth flowing through the system increases because the trade networks the palaces had built have not gone away, and now there is more space, more capacity, more demand. The second palaces are not the same as the first. They are richer. We call this period the Neopalatial, which means simply the time of the new palaces. It runs from about 1700 to about 1450 years before the Common Era. It is the period during which the civilization that Arthur Evans would one day call the Minoans becomes itself. Everything you have ever seen of them, in a museum, in a textbook, in a glossy photograph of a fresco that you remember from a childhood book about the ancient world, belongs to this period. It is 2.5 centuries long. It is a flicker in the longer measure of time, and in that flicker, on this small island in the middle of the sea around you, a culture builds something that no one in Europe had ever built before. A world of color. You are walking now, in the late afternoon, through the main entrance of the palace at Knossos in its second life. The year is something like 1600 years before the Common Era, in the early phase of the period we call Late Minoan Era. The palace covers an area of more than 20,000 square meters, which is, in measures you can hold in your hand, nearly 5 acres of continuous built space. It rises in places to 3 stories. It is ventilated by light wells, vertical shafts open to the sky, around which the rooms cluster, so that even the inner chambers, deep within the complex, receive a soft, indirect light that changes through the day with the color of the Aegean sky. You step from the bright stone of the western court into a corridor. The corridor walls have been freshly plastered and freshly painted. The plaster is still slightly cool to the touch. The pigments have been laid into the wet lime, so that when the lime dries, they will become part of the wall itself and outlast everything else in the building. The blue is the most striking thing. It is the blue of the deep water beyond the harbor, the blue of the sky over the mountain at midsummer, a blue so saturated that even now, 3,500 years later, fragments of it would hold their color against the light. They have ground the pigment from a stone imported from a long way away. Lapis lazuli is the easiest thing to imagine, though Egyptian blue, a manufactured pigment, is more likely. Either way, it is expensive, it is rare. It has been brought to the painter because the painter has asked for it. The painter is being paid by an authority that can afford to ask. You walk along the corridor. On either side, narrow processions of figures move with you in painted profile. They carry rhytons, the conical ritual vessels used for libations. They wear kilts and broad belts. Their long hair is gathered at the nape and falls down their backs. The line is fluid. The color is bright. The rhythm of the procession carries you forward through the painted gallery, which is also the actual gallery. The architecture and the painting working together as one piece. You turn into a smaller room. This is the room that Evans would call the Queen's Megaron, though he had no evidence at all that any queen had ever set foot in it. He named it for the convenience of the visitors who would come, and for his own narrative. The room is small and intimate by palatial standards. 2 columns flank an opening into a light well. Around the walls, dolphins swim across a pale band, blue and grey, their fins lifting and falling in the painted current. In the corner you can see, at the edge of the surviving plaster, a flash of a different fresco. A blue monkey crouched among saffron flowers, its hand reaching out to pluck the orange stamens from a yellow blossom. The monkey is rendered with real attention. The painter has seen monkeys, or the painter has seen Egyptian paintings of monkeys. Either way, the animal is present in the room with you, alive in the wet of the paint. A bell of light comes down from the light well above you. The room is cool. Somewhere, in the depths of the palace, a flute is being played. The notes are slow. You will never know what scale they were playing. You will never know what tune. The music of the Bronze Age died with the people who played it, leaving the instruments behind in graves and the pictures of the instruments on the walls. You know they had flutes and lyres. You do not know the songs. You step out of the small chamber and find yourself, after another corridor and a wide flight of gypsum stairs, in the central court. The court is enormous around you. It is paved in pale stone, worn smooth by feet. It is open to the sky. The afternoon light comes down into it almost vertically. Around the edges of the court, the upper stories of the palace rise, with their painted columns and their balconies. On the eastern side, the court is flanked by a row of half columns painted bright red, their capitals broad and cushioned, narrowing towards the floor in a way that no later Greek column would ever do. These are Minoan columns, downward tapering, made of cypress trunks set upside down so that the wider end is at the top. Evans, when he rebuilt parts of the palace in concrete in the 1920s, painted his concrete columns red in imitation of these, and the red columns you see in photographs of Knossos today are his. The originals were red too. You know that from the painted miniatures. But the red columns you would see standing now are his red, on his concrete, set into the line of the original architecture. In the middle of the court, the festival is about to begin. You stand at the edge with the crowd. There are perhaps 1,000 people pressed around the perimeter beside you. They are dressed in their best clothes. The women near you wear long flounced skirts in tiered bands of color. Their bodices are open at the front, in the Minoan fashion, leaving the breasts bare. They wear necklaces of carnelian and rock crystal and gold. Their hair is dressed in elaborate coils, held in place with bronze pins. The men wear short kilts and tight belts that pinch the waist into the slender line that Minoan art prizes. Children sit on shoulders. The air around you smells of crushed herbs and of the oil of the lamps that line the upper balconies. A bull is led into the court in front of you. It is enormous. The bulls of Minoan Crete are larger than any cattle alive in Europe today. The breed is older. The horns sweep forward in long curves, polished from the rubbing of the handlers. The bull's flanks are dark and ridged with muscle. It is led by ropes that are removed once it stands in the center of the court. The handlers step back. The bull lifts its head and bellows, so loud you feel it in your chest. The crowd is silent. From the eastern side of the court, 3 figures step out. 2 are young women. 1 is a young man. They are dressed alike, in tight loincloths and belts, their long dark hair held back by bands. Their bodies are lean and trained. They will, in the next several minutes, do something for which there is no parallel in any other Bronze Age culture you know, and which we still, after 120 years of looking at the paintings, do not entirely understand. The first young woman runs at the bull. She does not flinch. She accelerates as she approaches. The bull lowers its horns to meet her. At the last moment, just as the horns come up towards her chest, she leaps. Her hands close on the horns. The bull, by reflex, throws its head upward to dislodge her, and the upward thrust of the head is exactly the force the leaper has been waiting for. She uses it. She rolls her body forward over the bull's head, plants her hands on its broad shoulders, and vaults the entire length of its back in a slow somersault that lands her, feet first, on the paving stones behind it. The young man catches her by the waist as she lands. The crowd does not cheer. The crowd breathes out as one. You breathe out with them. The leap was an offering. You have just witnessed a sacrament. This is the bull leaping that the painted walls of Knossos preserve in the Thera frescoes, the most famous images that have come to us from the Minoan world. We do not know whether the leap was performed by trained athletes, or by religious initiates, or by both. We do not know what god was being addressed. We do not know whether the leap was meant to ensure fertility, to renew the kingship, to bind the community in the sight of the sacred, or simply, in its sheer beauty, to be itself the prayer. We know that it happened. We know that the bull was paramount. The horns of the bull, stylized in carved stone, line the roofs and the altars across the island. The rhytons are shaped like bull heads, with the rim at the neck and a hole drilled through the muzzle for libations to pour from. The myth that later Greeks would tell of the bull-headed monster in the maze beneath the palace is not history. It is a memory, distorted, of the centrality of the bull. The Minotaur is what the bull becomes when the Minoans are forgotten. You leave the court. In a small ground floor chamber off it, there is a series of stone-lined pits set into the floor. These are the temple repositories. They were sealed up at some point in the life of the palace and forgotten. Evans found them. Inside, packed in clay and broken faience, he found the figures that would become the most famous female images from the Bronze Age Aegean. You are looking at her now. She stands about 30 centimeters tall in front of you. She is faience, which is a glazed ceramic, fired in colors of cream and brown and dark blue. She wears a long-tiered skirt, banded in horizontal stripes, that flares from her waist to her feet. Her bodice is open at the front. Her breasts are bare. Her arms are extended out from her body and slightly upward, and in each hand she holds a snake, which winds around her arm and lifts its small head above her shoulder. Her face is composed. Her eyes are open and looking past you. Her hair is dressed under a high headdress. She is not smiling. She is the snake goddess. That is what Evans called her. He believed she represented a great mother goddess, a chthonic deity, a figure of fertility and the underworld combined. He believed she was the central object of Minoan religion. The modern view is more cautious. She may be a goddess, she may be a priestess, she may be an idealized image of either, made for the cult. She is one of two figures from the repository, and the larger of them was reconstructed by Evans from fragments that were not all in their original positions. The cat that sits on the head of one of the figures, in the photographs you have probably seen, was a separate fragment. It was not, as far as we can now tell, ever attached to the body of the goddess. It was set there by Evans because he thought it belonged. It made her more striking. It made her famous. The fame is real. The cat is a guess. What is not a guess is the gesture of the upraised arms. You will see this gesture again. You will see it in 300 years on a cold mountain plateau, in a shrine smaller than your living room, made of rough stones, in the hands of a figurine far cruder than this one, by the hands of people who could no longer make faience. The gesture will survive. The skill will not. We will come back to the woman with the upraised arms on the mountain. But first, you should see how far the world of the palaces could reach. Far enough. It turns out, that the painters of these walls traveled to Egypt and painted the same scenes on the walls of an Egyptian palace. You are standing now in the eastern Nile Delta at a site called Tel El Daba, which in the 18th dynasty was the city of Avaris. The reign is probably that of Thutmose III or of Hatshepsut, give or take a generation. The room you are in is a large hall in a royal palace. The walls around you have been freshly plastered. The plaster is wet. The artists working on the walls in front of you have come a long way to be here. They speak a language no Egyptian in the room understands. They have brought their own pigments, their own brushes, their own way of laying the lime, and they are painting, on these Egyptian walls, scenes of bull leaping. A great bull, charging across a background of mazes in the running spiral pattern that you would recognize instantly from Knossos. A leaper in mid-vault. Griffins, sphinxes, the half-mythical creatures that populate the painted halls of Knossos, here in a hall on the River Nile beside you. The Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak found these frescoes in the 1990s, and they changed the conversation. Before them, the connection between Egypt and Crete was a set of pots and a name, the Keftiu, that turned up in Egyptian tomb paintings showing tribute bearers carrying conical Minoan rhytons. After Bietak, the connection was direct and physical. Painters from Crete had been at the Egyptian court. They had been invited. They had been paid. The bull was leaping on the palace walls of the pharaoh. We do not know the political reason for their presence. Bietak's own hypothesis is that a Minoan princess had been married to an Egyptian prince, and that the frescoes were commissioned to make the bride feel at home. It is a hypothesis. It is not a proof. What it tells you, at minimum, is that the rulers of Egypt knew the rulers of Crete by name and by face, that there were channels of communication between the two palaces that ran deeper than commerce, and that the Minoans, for at least one period of their history, sat at a diplomatic table where the entire eastern Mediterranean met. The trade that flowed through that table was vast. You could lift one of the small Kamari's cups in your hand and feel almost nothing. The eggshell-thin pottery of Crete, the polychrome Kamari's wear. Light enough that you can hold a cup up to the sun and see the shadow of your fingers through the clay. It was being exported to Egypt and to the Levant. In return, the raw materials the bronze of Crete required were flowing in. Copper from Cyprus, where the great mines of the southern Mediterranean were already in full production. Tin from Cornwall, perhaps, or from the mountains of Afghanistan, 10,000 kilometers east, the tin moving along trade chains of intermediaries no one in Crete had ever met. Ivory from Syria, gold from Nubia, lapis from the same eastern mountains as the tin. You can see them on the table in front of you, raw, waiting to be worked. The bronze workshops of Knossos and Malia and Zakros were assembling, from materials gathered across half the known world, the daggers and pins and bowls and small statues that have come down to us. The Minoans did not have an empire in the way we would later use the word. They had something subtler. Scholars now prefer the term Minoanization, which describes the way that islands and coasts around them, from Thera off the Peloponnese to Miletus on the Anatolian shore to the Cycladic island of Thera, slowly adopted Minoan ways. You will see Minoan weights and measures on every harbour scale. You will see Minoan loom weights for the production of textiles in the back room of every weaver's house. You will see Minoan pottery shapes on every table. You will see Minoan religious imagery on every shrine wall. The places that took up these things were not conquered. They were not garrisoned. They simply, over a generation or two, began to do things the way the people of Crete did them, because the people of Crete were the wealthy ones. and to do things their way was to participate in the wealth. This is a kind of soft power that is more familiar to you than to most of the Bronze Age. And the religion of the Minoans lived in places that no later religion of the Mediterranean would quite return to. It lived on the tops of mountains. You are climbing now, in the cool of an early morning, up the long ridge that leads to the summit of Mount Juctas, a few kilometers south of Knossos. The mountain is not high by the standards of Crete. It rises only to about 800 meters. But it has a distinctive shape, a long flat summit that, when you see it from the north, resembles the profile of a sleeping man with his arms folded across his chest. The later Cretans would say it was the face of Zeus. The Minoans, before there was a Zeus, gave it some other name you do not know. At the top of the ridge, the ground levels out into a small natural terrace. The wind here is constant against you. Below you, the green and gold of the lowlands runs out to the blue of the northern sea. Above you, only the sky. There is a low wall of stones marking the boundary of the sacred precinct. There is no roof. There is no temple. There is nothing standing here but a small altar of stone, blackened by the smoke of offerings, and a series of pits set into the ground, in which the worshippers leave their gifts. You crouch by the pits. The gifts are made of clay. They are body parts, small terracotta legs, hands, feet, sometimes a torso, sometimes a head. The worshipper has come up the mountain to ask for healing in that part of the body, or to give thanks for healing that has been received. The pits in front of you are full of these limbs, broken and stacked, layer upon layer, year after year. Beside them lie the small figures of worshippers themselves, in attitudes of prayer, one hand raised to the brow in the Minoan gesture of devotion. Beside those, miniature ships, miniature animals, miniature jars. The mountain top is where you bring the model of what you need or what you wish to thank. There is no priesthood here that you can see. There is no central image of the god. There is the place, and there is the offering, and there is the wind, and there is, far below, the palace, which has paid for the road that brought you here. The sacred is in the high place itself. The mountain is the temple. The cave at the foot of the mountain is the temple too, though in a different mode. The Dictaean cave, further to the east, holds offerings of a different kind, swords and bronzes left in the dark of the rock, in the cold breath of the cavern. The mountain reaches up, the cave reaches down. Between them, the Minoan world holds itself. You should know, before you leave this terrace, that the beauty does not run all the way through. On the slopes below you, in a small temple at a place called Anemospilia, archaeologists found, in the late 1970s, the bones of 3 people inside a building destroyed by an earthquake around 1700 years before the Common Era. One of them was a young man lying on his side on a low platform in the central room, his bones bearing the marks of a body that had lost most of its blood before death. A bronze dagger lay across his ribs. The dagger was decorated with a boar and a bull. The other 2 skeletons were of older people, found nearby, crushed by the falling masonry. The interpretation, by the excavator Yannis Sakellarakas, and by many scholars since, is that what was happening in the temple at Anemospilia at the moment the earthquake struck was a human sacrifice. The earth was already moving. The priest was attempting, in extremity, to make an offering that would stop the shaking. The roof fell on all of them. The offering was not accepted. The reading is contested. Other scholars, Nano Marinatos, most prominent among them, argue that the young man on the platform was simply another victim of the collapse, that the dagger may have been ceremonial and not sacrificial. that we are imposing a narrative onto bones we cannot fully read. The argument continues. What is not contested is that the bones are there. What is not contested is that the beauty of the painted walls and the gold of the bee pendant and the calm of the dolphin fresco does not run all the way through the Minoan world. There is, alongside the beauty, the darker thing. There is the moment when the priest, in fear, reaches for the knife. There are, in fact, other moments. At the North House at Knossos, the excavator Peter Warren found, in a late Minoan stratum, the bones of at least 4 children, healthy at the time of their deaths. Mixed with the bones of butchered sheep, the knife-cut marks on the human bones matched, in their pattern, the cut marks on the animal bones beside them. Warren proposed, very carefully, that what he was looking at was a ritual of child sacrifice, perhaps performed in a moment of acute crisis, perhaps accompanied by ritual consumption. The proposal is contested too. The bones are real. The cut marks are real. The interpretation will be argued for as long as the field exists. The shadow is in the record. You do not get to ignore it because it spoils the painting on the wall. This is what a civilization looks like from the inside. It is not the postcard. It is the postcard and the bone pit, the bee pendant and the dagger, the dolphin fresco and the smoke of the offering on the high mountain. You are being asked to hold all of these together in the same gaze, knowing that the people who made the pendant were the same people who, in some other room, were reaching for the knife. You come down from the mountain in the late morning. The lowlands are bright. The fields are heavy with the early grain. The road back to Knossos winds through small farms where men and women are at work in the fields, where children are watching goats, where the dust of the road is fine and pale and rises around your sandals. You can see, in the distance, the long roof line of the palace rising above the olive trees. You can see the column of smoke from the workshops on the eastern side, where the bronze is being beaten. You can see, beyond the palace, the line of the northern sea, which today is calm. The sea is the wall. The sea is the road. The sea has, for nearly 300 years now, been kind to them. 100 kilometers to the north of where you stand, under that calm blue water, on the floor of the small island they call by a name we do not know, the earth is doing something it has done before. A long way down, in the chambers of magma that lie beneath the caldera, the pressure is building. It has been building, slowly, for a long time. The mountain on the island has been showing the small signs that a mountain shows before a great eruption. The animals on the island have begun to behave strangely. The smoke from the fissures has changed color. The water in the wells has gone warm. On the island itself, the people have been reading those signs. They are not stupid. They have lived on a volcano for generations, and they know what the volcano can do. If you stood on Thera today, in this final season, you would see them at work. The painters have already finished the great fresco of the spring lilies in the room of the West House. The lilies in bloom on a red volcanic ground, the swallows looping between them in pairs. The painters have laid down their brushes. The traders have been moving their goods to ships. The merchants have been packing the valuables, the gold, the carved stone seals, the bronze. The children are being walked down to the harbour past you. In the houses of the town, dishes are being put away on shelves, and shutters are being closed. The town that will, 3,500 years from now, be excavated under meters of pumice by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos and his successors. The town that you will hear called Akrotiri is in the slow process of being abandoned. There are no human bodies in the ruins. They read the signs. They got out. But the painters of Crete, 100 kilometers south, do not know what is coming. The bull leapers in the central court at Knossos do not know what is coming. The scribe pressing the signs into the wet clay of a tablet in the magazine at Zakros, who is, at this moment, on this morning, counting jars of saffron in the storeroom by lamplight, does not know what is coming. The morning is calm. The sea is the wall. The sea has always been the wall. The sea is about to move. It is, perhaps, mid-morning. The exact hour does not matter. You have come down from the high pasture, and you are standing now at the edge of the central court at Knossos, and the sun is high enough that the shadows are short. The bull leapers have not begun. The scribes are at their work in the magazine behind you. The pithoi are full of the autumn's oil, and the autumn's wine, and the year's grain, and the doors of the storeroom are open against the cool of the morning, and the smell of old olive oil sits, as it always sits, faint and sweet and sour, in the dark behind the lamps. Somewhere on the south coast, at Zakros, a scribe finishes counting saffron and reaches for a clean tablet. Somewhere in the harbour at Amnisos, 2 boys are mending a net. Somewhere at Phaistos, in the lower town, a woman is laying out bread on a wooden board. You can hear, faintly, the bell of a goat in the lower fields. You can taste the dry dust of the road in the back of your throat. 100 kilometers to the north, on the small island we still do not know the proper name for, the mountain releases. It begins as a sound, not a roar, a pressure, first, in the bones of your ear, a feeling more than a noise, the way a thunderstorm announces itself before you can name what it is. Then the noise itself, low at first, building, the ground beneath you, 100 kilometers south of the mountain, trembles faintly. You can feel it through the soles of your feet on the stone of the court. The lamps in the magazine behind you sway. A cup on a shelf in the small house in Amnisos rattles and falls and breaks. The woman at Phaistos pauses with her hands in the dough. The boys at the net stand up and look north. You turn your head north too. What they see, what you would see, standing on the harbour wall at Amnisos in the late morning of that day, is a column. It is rising from the sea. It begins as a smudge on the northern horizon, a dark thickening above the line of the water you have known your whole life, and within minutes it is taller than any cloud you have ever known. Within an hour it is climbing into the upper sky. You crane your neck and you still cannot see the top of it. It is the color of wet stone and old smoke. Lightning runs along its inner edges, brief and silent at this distance. It is, by any modern reckoning, between 30 and 40 kilometers tall, a vertical river of ash and pulverized pumice and gas climbing through the troposphere and breaching into the stratosphere, where the high winds will take what it has thrown up and carry it east, across the eastern Mediterranean, across Anatolia, into the high atmosphere of the world. The volcanologists today, looking at what is left of the caldera, call it a VEI 6 or a VEI 7. They mean one of the largest eruptions of the last 5,000 years. They mean, in the long memory of the rocks, there have been very few mornings like this one. But the rocks are not what you are looking at. You are looking at a column of dark that is eating the northern sky. The morning has dimmed around you. The air you are breathing smells of stone and of something else, an undersmell of sulfur, faint at first, growing. Birds are leaving the trees on the coast. The dogs at the edge of the court are standing very still beside you, the hair lifting along their backs. On Thera itself, the town we will come to call Akrotiri is already silent. It has been silent for some time. Whether that silence is days or weeks or months, No one alive in 1939 or 2026 can say for certain, but what is certain is what is not in the ruins. There are no bodies at Akrotiri. There are no children's bones in the bedrooms. There are no old men in the doorways. The dishes are stacked on the shelves where you would expect to find them. The painted walls with their lilies and their swallows and their blue monkeys still hold the color of a spring morning. The beds are made, but the people are gone. The valuables are gone. The gold is gone. They read what the mountain was telling them. They walked their children down to the harbor and they sailed. Where they went, we do not know. To Crete, perhaps. To the other Cyclades. To the bottom of the sea in some lost storm. The ships did not come back to the town to write their own ending. The town simply waited, in the days or weeks before the final eruption, for what was coming. You can stand inside one of those houses today, 3,500 years later, on the wooden walkways the excavators have laid over the floors, and you can see the painted swallows looping above your head, exactly where the painter left them. It is the painters of Crete who do not know. It is the scribe at Zakros, still counting saffron, who does not know. It is the boys at the net at Amnisos who, having stood up to look at the column, sit back down on the harbour wall and watch it grow, because what else is there to do? You, on the court at Knossos, do not know either. You only see the column. You only feel, in the back of your neck, the small wrongness of the dimming sun. The caldera collapses. The mountain falls into itself. The sea, which has been held back, rushes in to fill the new emptiness, and what the sea does next is the second great act of the morning. The wave that leaves the new caldera is not a wave in the sense that you, standing on a beach in summer, would recognize. It is the sea pushed off its bed by an event the sea was not designed for. It moves outward in every direction. It crosses the 100 kilometers to Crete in something less than half an hour. At Amnisos, if you were standing there with the boys at the net, you would see the sea do something the sea has never done. It pulls back. The water in the harbour withdraws from the harbour wall in front of you, exposing the wet stones and the green weed and the dropped pottery of 50 years of fishing. The sand of the inner beach lies bare in the sun. Boats settle, briefly, on their keels in the mud. There is a long quiet in which the men on the harbour wall stand with their mouths open and the gulls cry in confusion above the suddenly dry stone. You hold your breath. Then the sea comes back. We will come back to the man with the trowel, the wealthy Englishman in the pith helmet who will, 3,500 years from this morning, pay his own money to buy this hill above this village and start digging in March of 1900. But first, the wave. The wave hits the northern coast of Crete in a series, not as one wall but as a sequence, the way these things move, one surge and then another, each one tearing the harbour apart in a different direction. The boats in the harbours are lifted and broken and lifted again. The harbour wall at Amnisos, which was built of stones the size of your chest, is rearranged. 40 years ago, in the late 20th century, the Greek-American tsunami scientist Kostas Sinolakis walked the eastern coast of Crete at Palaikastro, looking for what such a wave would have left behind 3,500 years later. And he found it, pumice in layers that should not be there, marine shells stranded in soil that the sea no longer reaches, the bones of sea creatures inland where no current today could carry them, cattle skeletons mixed with debris that bore the unmistakable signs of having been violently moved by water. The wave was real. The wave is in the soil. It is, even now, readable in the stratigraphy by anyone who knows what they are looking for. The buoys at the net are not, in any meaningful sense, available for comment. If you were standing with them on the wall, you are not either. The harbour at Amnisos is silent in a new way. The fleet of the northern coast, the fleet that had carried Minoan goods to Egypt for 2 centuries, the fleet that had been one of the quiet engines of the thalassocracy, is broken or scattered or lost. The trading hub at Akrotiri, the great Minoanized town on Thera that had been the staging post for Cycladic trade, is buried under meters of pumice that will preserve its frescoes intact until Spiridon Marinatos starts to dig in 1967. The ash that the column lifted into the stratosphere comes down across eastern Crete in the days that follow, a fine grey-white grit that you can taste on your tongue and feel between your teeth, that settles on your hair and on the back of your hand and on the surface of the water in the cistern, and that lies, in places, several centimeters deep on the fields and the roads and the leaves of the olive trees. At Mochlos, at Palaikastro, the modern excavator can put a knife into the soil and find the ash layer, the same band of grey, still telling the same story you are now living through. The sky over Crete is, for some days, brown. The afternoons are colder than they should be. The sunsets, for weeks or months, are blood red across the whole eastern Mediterranean as the high ash bends the light. You watch the sunset in the months after, and the sun is the wrong colour, a long way to the south. In Egypt, the king's astronomers will note that the sun has been wearing a strange face. In the Hittite records, far to the north, a year of bad omens will be remembered. The mountain on Thera has spoken, and the world has heard. And then, here is the part that the listener was not expecting, the part that makes the story stranger than any of the simple endings. The palaces do not fall. Knossos stands. The court you were standing on is still there. The fresco of the dolphins is intact in the queen's megaron behind you. The throne, whatever it was used for, is still where it was. The scribe at Zakros, by some chance not killed in the harbour, sits down again with a clean tablet and a sharp reed and continues to count the saffron. The bull leapers, in the seasons that follow, vault again over the backs of the bulls in the central court at Knossos under what is now, for a year or two, a strange dim sky. The painters mix their lapis blue and paint again. The pithoi in the magazines are refilled, season by season, with the recovering harvests. The trade routes, damaged, begin to reach south to Egypt again. The keftiu in the Egyptian tomb paintings do not yet disappear. The civilization that the volcano was supposed to have ended did not, in any structural sense, end. It went on. For somewhere between 50 and 150 years, depending on which chronology you accept, Minoan Crete continued. Palaces and frescoes and linear A tablets and B pendants and storerooms full of oil, in the long shadow of an event that had moved the sky. You walk through it, you age inside it. You watch the bull leapers vault again in the central court, and the leap is still beautiful, and the painted dolphins on the wall are still bright, and the smell of the olive oil in the magazine behind you is still faint and sweet and sour, and underneath all of it, something is quietly going wrong that you cannot yet name. This is the moment, before you walk further into the slow century, to say something about the chronology, because the disagreement is not academic, and it is not small. In 1939, Spiridon Marinatos proposed that the wave from Thera might have ended a civilization. In the decades since, 2 different sciences have walked toward different answers. The radiocarbon evidence, championed by Sturt Manning at Cornell, and the work on the olive branch that was caught alive in the pumice, read tree ring by Walter Friedrich and his colleagues at Aarhus, points to a date between 1627 and 1600 BCE. The Egyptological evidence, championed by Malcolm Wiener and by Manfred Biertak at the dig at Tel El Daba in the Nile Delta, where Minoan-style frescoes were found in the strata of the early 18th dynasty, points to a date a century later, somewhere between 1530 and 1500 BCE. The two camps still argue. The olive branch and the Egyptian potsherd give different answers. The most consequential eruption in human history, the one whose ash you can taste in the soil at Pallaicastro, the one you have just lived through standing on the court at Knossos, is dated within a window 100 years wide. We do not know what year the sky went dark. We know only that it did. Something else has shifted, though. Not the architecture, not the script. Something underneath. The sea, which was the wall and the road and the long kindness of 3 centuries, has done a thing the people had not believed it could do. The Cycladic hub is gone. The fleet is reduced. The shipyards on the north coast are rebuilding from less than they had before. The painted lilies on the wall of the West House at Akrotiri, the lilies that the priestess with the upraised arms might once have known, are sealed under pumice and will not see the light again for 3,500 years. The woman on the mountain at Mount Juktas, the woman in the tiered skirt, the one we have been carrying with us since the first act, the priestess, in the gesture that meant offering and threshold, and the holding of something sacred, her shrine is still there. The peak sanctuary still receives the small clay votives. The offerings continue, but the sky above the sanctuary is dimmer now than it was. The afternoons are colder. The blue of the lapis on the freshly painted wall in the new room at Knossos does not, perhaps, hold the quite same brilliance it held in the year of the bull leapers. In the long noon of the Neopalatial, the palaces stand. The civilization continues. The wound is invisible. The wound will take, in the end, about 1.5 centuries to do its work, but the work has begun. The years that follow, the years you walk through now if you are still on the court at Knossos and you are willing to age inside this story, are, on the surface, ordinary. The trade with Egypt resumes. The frescoes are repainted. A generation grows up that did not see the column. A second generation grows up that did not hear the stories at first hand. By the time the third generation is at work in the bronze workshops on the east side of the palace at Knossos, the eruption is something that grandparents remembered, the year the sky went brown. That one year, that one strange year. The pithoi in the storerooms are full. The dolphin fresco is still bright. The bee pendant of Malia is still being made, with its tiny granulation, by goldsmiths whose grandfathers' grandfathers made them. Linear A is still pressed into the soft clay. The civilization is recovering. The civilization is, in many ways, fine. And then, somewhere around 1450 BCE, the fires start. It is not one fire, it is a wave of fires. You see them from the high road above the Messara if you happen to be on the high road that night. Phaistos burns. The great palace in the Messara plain, with its broad western court and its theatral steps, and its archive of clay tablets, and its administration that reached down to every small farm in the valley, burns. The roof of the central magazine falls in. The pithoi crack in the heat. The linear A tablets, which were soft clay before the fire began, are baked hard by it, which is the only reason any of them survive at all. Malia burns. The great palace on the northern coast, with its kernos and its loggia and its odd circular stone with the cup marks that no one has ever fully explained, burns. The storage magazines burn. The houses around it burn. Zakros, in the far east of the island, the last of the palaces, with its imported elephant tusks and its Egyptian alabaster and its rhytons of carved rock crystal still on the workshop floor, burns. The fires at Zakros are sudden enough that the workshops are left mid-task, the unfinished pieces dropped where they were being worked. Gornia burns. The villas burn. The settlements at Thera and at Moklos burn. Across 200 kilometers of island, in a coordinated horizon of destruction that no natural cause can account for, in a pattern of fires that an earthquake does not make, and a storm does not make, and a single accident certainly does not make, the Minoan palatial world goes up in smoke. The smell on the wind, if you are out under the night sky in that year, wherever, exactly in the decades it sits, is the specific oily black smoke of Cretan olive wood burning. The smoke of beams that had been in those roofs for 2 centuries, the resinous black smoke that leaves its trace on the walls as a film you can still see in the stratigraphy. The smoke that means an ending. The taste of it stays in the back of your throat for days. Only one palace does not burn. Knossos stands. The court you have been standing on for the last 100 years of this story is still there. The fresco of the dolphins behind you is unblackened. This is the strange shape of the catastrophe. The palaces of Crete are destroyed in a wave of deliberate fires, and one is spared, and the one that is spared is the one that, in the years after, looks as if it has changed hands. Whatever is happening, the palace at Knossos is not the victim. Whatever is happening, the palace at Knossos is, in some way, the evidence is still trying to make clear, the instrument. We will come back, eventually, to the high cold of the Lassithi Mountains and to the small refuge settlement at a place called Karphi, where the last of the people who had built this palace will, 3 centuries from now, sit out the long dark with what is left of their gods. But first, the change in the writing. In the magazines at Knossos, after the fires, if you walk in behind the new scribe and look over his shoulder, the tablets being pressed into the wet clay look, at first glance, the same. The reed presses the same kinds of marks. The clay is the same Cretan clay. The lamplight against your hand is the same, but the script is not the same. Linear A is gone. In its place, on the floor at Knossos, is something a scholar will one day call Linear B, a script that is built from the bones of Linear A, that uses many of its signs, that looks like its descendant but that is being used to write a different language. A scribe trained on Linear A could no longer, after the change, read his own tablets. The signs on the wall mean different sounds now. For half a century after the tablets are found, no one can read them either. Arthur Evans, who pulled the first of them from the earth at Knossos in 1900, would die in 1941 without knowing what they said. A young American classicist named Alice Kober, working at Brooklyn College through the 1930s and 1940s, builds the foundation. No one else has had the patience to build the careful statistical grid of which signs occur with which others. The discovery that the language being written has inflectional endings. The slow construction, on hand-cut index cards in the long evenings, of the framework that any decipherment would have to use. She dies in 1950, at the age of 43, before she sees what her work will allow. In 1952, an English architect and amateur cryptographer named Michael Ventris, building directly on Alice Kober's grids, announces on a BBC radio broadcast that he has read the tablets. If you had been listening to your radio in London on the 1st of July that year, you would have heard him say it. The language they are written in is Greek, not the Greek of Homer, a form of Greek older than Homer by 500 years. An archaic form with strange spellings and an alphabet of syllables rather than letters, but Greek, unmistakably and grammatically Greek, the same root tongue from which the language of Plato and Sappho will one day grow. The academic world is, for a moment, very quiet. The people in the magazines at Knossos, in the 14th century BCE, the people counting the sheep and the wheat and the wool of the surviving palace, were not Minoans, they were Greeks. The Mycenaean mainland, which we will come back to in its own collapse before this episode ends, had reached across the sea and taken the one palace that had been spared. You can see the new people in the ground around Knossos. If you walk out, in those years, past the western court and across the slope where the old olive trees are, you will find, in cemeteries that did not exist before, a new style of burial. The graves are called the warrior graves. They are mainland in their shape. They are filled with mainland goods. There are bronze swords in them, long, leaf-shaped, the kind a man fights with on a battlefield, not the kind that hangs ceremonially on a wall. You can pick one up in the museum at Heraklion now and feel the weight of it across your palm. There are daggers with inlaid scenes of lion hunts in gold and silver, scenes a Minoan painter would not have set down. There are boars' tusk helmets laboriously assembled from the curved tusks of dozens of wild pigs, sewn onto a leather cap, the helmet that Homer will describe in the Iliad 500 years later, the helmet of a class of warrior who has now arrived on Crete and who is being buried in his armor. There are chariot fittings, there are spear butts, there are the marks of a militaristic elite installing itself in the palace that had, for 2 centuries, been the most famously unfortified palace in the ancient world. You did not see them arrive. No one quite did. The contrast is bewildering. The palace itself, the architecture, has not changed. If you walk in through the western entrance, the frescoes on the walls are still the frescoes of the Minoan painters' dolphins, the lily prince, the bull, the snake. The ceremonial spaces are still ceremonial in the Minoan style. The bullhorns are still on the roof above you, but the men in the graves around the palace died with their swords by their hands. The bureaucrats in the magazines press Greek words into Minoan-derived clay. The palace has become a kind of hybrid thing, Minoan in its body and Greek in its tongue, performing the old ceremonies in a new language whose words the painters of the frescoes would not have understood. How it happened, we do not know. The honest answer, when you push past the certainties of the textbooks and the brochures, is that we do not know. You are allowed to sit with that. Was it an invasion? Did Mycenaean ships from Pylos and Mycenae and Tyrans cross the sea, take the harbours, march on the palaces, set the fires across the island and install themselves at Knossos? Was it a takeover that followed the fires rather than causing them? Opportunists, arriving after some internal Minoan civil war, had already burned the rivals to Knossos and finding the surviving palace ripe for the picking. Was it a more gradual thing? Generations of Mycenaean traders and Mycenaean wives and Mycenaean priests slowly accumulating in Knossos, becoming the dominant faction at court, finally taking the palace from within and then turning on the other palaces. The Belgian archaeologist Jan Driessen has spent his career describing the resulting Knossian administration as something he calls territorially discontinuous, a network of loyalties and obligations. Stretched across the island, more like a patchwork than a kingdom, a hybrid administration that controlled what it could and let the rest alone. The evidence does not, in the end, support a clean story. The fires are real. The script change is real. The new graves are real. The mechanism is in the dark. What is also in the dark is the question of what the people on Crete called themselves in this strange new century. They are still there. They are still in the villages you can see from the high road. They are still in the workshops. The bee pendant is still being made, somewhere, by goldsmiths, whose lineage runs back to the long noon. The linear A scribe at Zakros, if he survived the fires there, found no one who needed him to count saffron any more. The peak sanctuary on Mount Juktas, the shrine of the woman with the upraised arms, the shrine you climbed to in the first part of this telling, is still receiving small terracotta offerings, but the offerings are coarser now, the votives less carefully made, the figurines a little less skilled in their modeling than they were in the great century. The people are still going up the mountain. Their gods, perhaps, are still listening. But the lowland palace below is being administered in a language the priestess does not speak, by men who buried their dead with swords. If you go up the mountain path one of these evenings, in the cold of the late autumn, and you stand again at the small shrine, you can still see her, the woman with her arms in the air. The same gesture, the same offering, the world below her changing in a way she does not entirely yet know. And then Knossos itself burns. The date is contested somewhere between 1375 and 1200 BCE. The argument is still going on among scholars more patient than you or I to settle it. But somewhere in those 2 centuries, the last palace, the one that had been spared in 1450, the one that had been hybrid Greek Minoan for 5 generations or 8, falls to fire, the same oily black smoke of olive wood, the same baking of the clay tablets, which is the only reason you have them today, the linear B records of the last days of Mycenaean Knossos, the lists of sheep and wheat, and the offerings to gods whose names you can now read, are baked into permanence by the fire that destroys the building they were filed in. The roof collapses. The pithoi crack. The frescoes are blackened. The palace is silent in a way the palace has never been silent. You can stand in the ruin of it now, in the Cretan afternoon, and the absence is the same absence. No new palace is built. The Minoan palatial world, which had survived an eruption and a tsunami and a wave of arson and a takeover and 150 years of being run by people from the wrong sea, is finally over. The model of civilization that had built itself around a great unfortified house at the center of an island is finished. What remains on Crete, after the last fire at Knossos, is people. Farmers in the lowlands, goatherds in the hills, fishermen on the coasts, the remains of the old craft traditions, attenuating generation by generation. The remains of the old religion, attenuating with them. The old language, still spoken in some valleys, no longer written by anyone in any script that the new masters care about. The new masters, whoever they were and whatever their loyalties had become in the meantime, did not ask the question. They had no interest in the question. The people who had built the palaces and pressed the saffron tablets and painted the dolphins on the wall of the Queen's Megaron had a name for themselves, once. By the time the last palace burned, the name was already going. By the time the Greeks of the classical period wrote about King Minos and his labyrinth, the name was gone. The sea, which had been the wall and the road and the long kindness, had moved against them. The mainland, which they had known mostly as a trade partner and a curious cousin, had reached out and taken what the sea had spared. The world they had built, the painted walls, the bee pendant, the priestess on the mountain with her hands in the air, the boys mending nets on the harbour wall at Amnisos was, in the slow swallow of those centuries, becoming a memory in someone else's language, and the memory, in that language, was already starting to bend toward myth. There are, however, still people on the island. There are, even now, lights in the houses in the hills. You can see them from wherever you are standing in the night above the ruined palace, small and yellow and patient. The story is not yet finished. The longest part of the forgetting is still to come. There are, however, still people on the island. There are, even now, lights in the houses in the hills. You can see them from wherever you are standing in the night above the ruined palace, small and yellow and patient. The story is not yet finished. The longest part of the forgetting is still to come. It comes slowly at first. The last fire at Knossos has gone out, in the version of this you are watching. The roof beams have done what wet olive wood does in the rain, which is to soften and to subside and to smell, for a long time, like a thing that is decomposing in a cellar. The walls hold. The walls will hold, in places, for the next 3,000 years, but no one is repainting them. No one is mixing the lime and the lapis for the blue. The blue, which was the colour of the long noon, fades a little every season you are not watching. The blue, in 100 years, is something you can see only if you know exactly where on the wall to look. The blue, in 200 years, is gone, even to you. What is happening on the wider sea, in those decades, is a thing larger than Crete. It is the late 12th century before the Common Era now, in the time you are imagining, and the whole Eastern Mediterranean is beginning to lose its grip on itself. The Hittite Empire, the great power of central Anatolia, the empire that had treated with pharaohs as an equal, simply ends. Its capital at Hattusa is burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palaces on the Greek mainland, the citadels of Pylos and Tiryns, and Mycenae itself, the very places whose warrior sons had taken Knossos a few generations earlier, are burned in their turn. The cities of the Levant, the trade hubs at Ugarit and Alalak and Megiddo, fall one after another. A confederation of raiders the Egyptians will call the Sea Peoples is moving along the coasts, and no one alive today entirely knows who they were, whether they were a cause or a symptom, whether they were a fleet or a migration, whether they sailed in unison or in scattered desperation. What is clear, even to you, lying here 3,000 years later, is that the international system that had bound the Bronze Age together, the courier ships moving copper from Cyprus and tin from somewhere past the Zagros, the diplomatic marriages, the gift exchanges of ivory and ostrich eggs, that system is unravelling, and Crete is not exempt from the unravelling. The sea, which had been the wall and the road, becomes, for the people you have been following, a problem. The sea you can no longer trust to bring you news of friendly ports. The sea you can no longer send your son out onto, with the certainty that he comes home. The harbour towns on the north coast of Crete, the small whitewashed places where, in your imagination, you have already watched a boy mending nets, begin to empty out, not in panic. In the slow way that places empty when people decide, one family at a time, that there is no reason any longer to live within reach of whoever might be coming over the horizon next. The villas in the lowlands are abandoned. The farms in the plains are abandoned. The small holdings along the coast roads are abandoned. The doors stand open in the way you have seen old doors stand open in any abandoned village. The olive trees go on, flowering above empty courtyards. The bees, who do not know anything has changed, go on making the honey for no one to gather. The people go up. This is the part of the story that, if you have ever stood at the bottom of a steep place and looked at a small village stuck high on its side, you already understand without anyone telling you. They go up because up is harder to get to. They go up because up is where you can see anyone coming, hours before they arrive. They go up because the gods, the old gods, the woman with the upraised arms you climb to on Mount Juktas in the long noon of this story, have always lived on the high places, and the high places might still keep them. And the highest place they go is to the cold of the Lassithi Mountains and to the small refuge settlement at a place called Karphi. A British archaeologist called Hilda Pendlebury and her husband John, working through the 1930s, will be the first to dig there in any serious way. A Polish scholar called Krzysztof Nowicki will, decades later, walk the slopes and map the whole pattern of these high refuges and put Karphi properly into its context. But for now, in the 12th century before the Common Era, no one is excavating anything. People are building. They are building on a saddle of rock at nearly 1,100 meters above the sea, a settlement of rough stone houses, 2 or 3 rooms each, walls of unworked field stone laid up without mortar against a wind that does not stop. Karphi is bleak. You can feel the bleak in the description, and you can feel it in the place itself if you ever go there. The wind comes off the Aegean and finds no palace wall to interrupt it. The winters are long, the growing season is short, the soil is thin. The view, in compensation, is enormous. From Karphi you can see down to the coast where the boats once moored at Malia. You can see, on a clear day, almost to the sea itself. You can see anything coming, hours before it arrives. You can understand, standing there, why anyone would have chosen to be cold rather than to be reachable. The people who built Karphi were not planning to come down again soon. The people who built Karphi were planning to outlast something. What they brought with them up the mountain is, in its way, the saddest and most stubborn thing in this whole telling. They brought the gestures. They did not bring the painters. They did not bring the goldsmiths. They did not bring the architects who knew how to build a 4-story palace with internal light wells and running water. Those crafts are already gone in the generations since the last fire at Knossos, gone with the last apprentices who had nowhere to apprentice. What they brought up the mountain was the memory of what those crafts had been for. They brought the religion in the only form they still had it. In one of the small rooms at Karphi, in a shrine on the eastern edge of the settlement, archaeologists working there in the 1930s found a group of figurines. The largest of them is about 1/2 meter high. She is made of coarse local clay, hollow-bodied, hand-built rather than wheel-thrown. The surface scored with rough lines where a careful fresco painter would once have laid the smooth plaster. She has the wide skirt of the old priestesses. She has the bare upper body. She has her arms in the air. The gesture is exactly the gesture you climb to see in the first part of this telling at the peak sanctuary on Mount Juktas in the long noon when the world was painted blue. The same arms, the same offering, the same address to whatever is above the clouds you are now lying under. But the craft has come down. You can see in the figurine, even in the museum photograph you can pull up on your phone, that the woman who made it, 300 years after the last fresco master died, was working from a memory of a memory. The proportions are not right. The face is barely a face. The hollow body sits a little crookedly on its base. She is poor. She is patient. She is the descendant, by an unbroken thread of 300 winters in the mountains, of the bare-breasted faience goddess at Knossos you met in the long noon. And she is, in some way that is hard to put into words at this hour of the night when you are listening, the same woman. There is a candle in the shrine, perhaps. There is, perhaps, a small clay cup of olive oil. There is, certainly, the wind. There is a goat herd, somewhere on the slope below, calling to a dog. There is, on the night you are imagining, the same sky over the mountains that has always been over them, the cold high stars you can see from your own window, if you got up to look. The stars that the woman with the upraised arms is still addressing in her old language, the language no one will ever read. That language goes on for a little while longer, not in the palaces. The palaces are rubble, not in the official records, because there are no official records anymore, no scribes to press the wet clay with a reed, but in the speech of the families who came up the mountain, and in the speech of their grandchildren, and in the speech of small, isolated communities scattered across eastern Crete for a few more centuries, the old tongue keeps being spoken. By the Iron Age, by the time the Dorian Greeks have arrived on the island, and the Mycenaean Greek of the warrior graves has, in its turn, become a different kind of Greek. There are still pockets where the old language is heard. The later Greeks of the classical period have a name for these people. They call them the Etio-Cretans. It means the true Cretans, the ones who were here before. At a small inland place called Phaistos, in the far east of the island, inscriptions are carved in the Greek alphabet, the new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. The alphabet you and I would recognize as the parent of our own, but the words those Greek letters spell are not in any language anyone can read. They are short. They are formal. They are almost certainly the last written remains of the language the priestess on Mount Juktas was praying in. 3,000 years before the Common Era and 1,000 years after the palaces went silent, the Etio-Cretan inscriptions exist. You can see them in a museum case. You can read every letter and not understand a single word. The last speakers of a Bronze Age tongue, writing their last words in someone else's letters, and no one alive, no one then, no one since, no one in any university you could write to tomorrow could decipher what they were saying, and then even those inscriptions stop. The last person who could speak the words dies in some unrecorded year in the Iron Age, and the language dies with that mouth, and there is no witness. What the rest of the Greek world does, in the meantime, is forget. By the time of Homer, somewhere in the 8th century, before the Common Era, 500 years after the last fire at Knossos, the memory has bent itself into something else. Homer speaks, in the Iliad, of a Crete of 100 cities, the line you may half remember from school. He speaks of King Minos, who ruled at Knossos and gave laws every 9 years. He speaks of the labyrinth and of the monster within it. By the time the classical Athenians are building the Parthenon, Knossos is a hill above a village. The village is small. The hill is grown over with thyme and wild fennel, and the boys of the village play among low ruined walls without entirely knowing what they are walking on, in much the way you might have, as a child, walked over the foundations of a thing you did not know was there. The old palace is a story. The old religion is the story of a monster. The snake goddess is in the soil, and no one is looking for her. 2,500 years pass like this. The Roman Empire comes and goes over the Mediterranean. The Byzantine centuries pass. The island falls to the Arabs and is taken back by the Greeks. It falls to the Venetians, who build harbour walls and churches. It falls to the Ottomans, who build minarets. The villagers in the small place at the foot of the hill, who by now call themselves the people of the village of Makritichos, go on grazing their goats among the same low walls and the same wild thyme you can still smell on the hill today. The hill above them is just a hill. It has, perhaps, a name. The name is not the name the people who built the palace called it. The palace is so deep under the soil and the centuries that no one even quite remembers there had been a palace. There had been, maybe, a king once. There had been, maybe, a monster. There had been, certainly, 2,500 years of the kind of dust you would not, if you were standing on it, think to dig through. And then a man with a trowel arrives. The wealthy Englishman in the pith helmet you were told about earlier. 3,500 years ago in this telling, as a thing still in the impossible future, becomes at the very end of the 19th century of the Common Era, a thing in your present tense. His name is Arthur Evans. He is the son of a prosperous antiquarian, John Evans, whose money came from paper milling and whose passion was prehistoric flints. The son inherited both the money and the passion. He is keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. He has, for years, been collecting small carved seal stones in the markets of Athens and Crete. Little carnelian and chalcedony beads with tiny pictures of bulls and octopuses and labyrinthine signs on them, the kind of beads you could still, with patience, find in a dealer's case today, and he has come to suspect they are coming from somewhere on Crete, from a civilization no one has yet identified. In 1894 he comes to Crete to look for it. He walks the Kephala hill, above the village of Makritichos, a few kilometers south of the modern town of Heraklion. He knows that another man, a Cretan merchant called Minos Kalokarinos, whose own first name is the name of the legend, had already, in 1878, dug a small trial trench into the hill and had found the tops of enormous storage jars, the pithoi, taller than a person, the kind of jars that hold a whole household's olive oil for a year. Kalokarinos had been forced to stop because of the politics of the late Ottoman period. The German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, fresh from his triumph at Mycenaean, had tried to buy the hill in 1886 and had walked away because the price was too high and the legal title too tangled. The hill, in 1894, is still waiting. Evans buys it. He uses his own money. He buys it outright because he is the kind of wealthy Englishman in the late 19th century who can simply do that. He waits, then, for Crete to become free of Ottoman administration, which it does in the late 1890s, and then he assembles a team, a Scottish field archaeologist called Duncan Mackenzie, a young English architect called Theodore Fife, and later a draftsman called Piet de Jong, and on the 23rd day of March, in the year 1900, 3,500 years from the morning on which a priestess once climbed to the peak sanctuary above this very hill, the digging begins. What comes out of the ground is, in the first weeks, almost more than the men with the trowels can take in. Within 4 days they have found the corner of a small chamber with a stone bench around 3 of its walls, and, against the 4th wall, a gypsum throne. They are calling it the throne room before the season is out. The walls of it are painted with griffins, in fragments. Through the spring and into the summer, room after room emerges corridors, light wells, stone stairs going down and other stone stairs going up. The great storage magazines, with the pithoi still in their rows. The residential quarter, with the dolphin frescoes still on the wall in pieces. By the end of the first season, Evans has uncovered a palace of nearly 5 acres. The civilization no one had a name for has a name now. He gives it one. He calls these people the Minoans, after King Minos of the myth, because no one will ever know what they called themselves, and he has to call them something. A few years later, in 1908, An Italian archaeologist working at the southern palace of Phaistos, Luigi Pernier, will find in a small basement room a clay disc the size of a saucer. It will be stamped on both sides with a spiral of 45 separate pictographic signs, heads in plumed helmets, fish, walking figures, ears of corn pressed into the wet clay with what must have been a set of individual stamps. The Phaistos disc is unique in all of the world. It does not match Linear A. It does not match the Cretan hieroglyphic. It has no relatives. It has, in the long centuries since Pernia lifted it out of its basement, defeated every serious attempt to decipher it. It is, in some way, the perfect emblem of the whole problem you have been listening to. It is the past, speaking clearly. You can hear it speaking. You cannot make out a single word. What Evans does next is the thing that, for as long as people care about the Minoans, will be argued about. He does not only dig, he rebuilds, in the way you have perhaps seen any wealthy enthusiast rebuild a thing he loves. He pours reinforced concrete, the modern industrial concrete of the early 20th century, over the ancient gypsum and limestone. He reconstructs entire upper stories of the palace that had collapsed in the second millennium before the Common Era. He paints the concrete columns a deep reddish brown, the color he believes the original cypress wood columns must have been. He commissions a Swiss father and son team of artists, Émile Guilieron and his son, also called Émile, to restore the frescoes. And the Guilierons restore them with the confident hand of the Art Nouveau period in which they are living and working. Tiny chips of original ancient plaster, sometimes only a few square centimeters, are framed by enormous fields of newly painted, freshly imagined Edwardian fresco, and the whole composition is placed on the wall as though it had always looked exactly that way. The Prince of Lilies, the famous figure striding through a field of papyrus with a crown of lily blossoms on his head. The image you have probably seen on a tourist postcard of Knossos at some point in your life is assembled from fragments of at least 3 entirely unrelated frescoes. The torso belongs to one figure, the crown belongs to another, the legs belong to a third. The saffron gatherer, originally restored by Evans and the Guilierons as a small blue boy crouched picking the saffron crocus, turns out, when modern scholars look again, to be a blue monkey. The cat on the head of the great snake goddess in the Heraclean Museum, the cat that has been on the head of every reproduction of that figurine for 120 years, is a stray fragment from an unrelated piece. Evans put it there. It belongs to nothing. It belongs to him. The argument among the scholars who came after Sinclair Hood, Colin Renfrew, Nano Marinatos, Jan Driessen, is not really an argument about whether Evans was a charlatan. He was not. He worked at colossal scale, with the methods of his time. He saved fragile ruins from a century of weathering. He created the categories and the chronology and the sheer language by which we still talk about this civilization today. The argument is about how much of what you see when you walk through Knossos on a hot afternoon in May with a tour group is the Minoans, and how much of it is Arthur Evans. And the answer is uncomfortable. A great deal of what you see is Arthur Evans, the peaceful, matriarchal, goddess-centered, sea-loving, art-mad Minoan utopia that is in every textbook and every documentary and every souvenir shop print. You may have seen that utopia is partly real and partly a piece of Edwardian England's quiet horror at its own modernity, projected backwards onto a civilization that could not contradict it. In 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris building on the patient gridwork of an American classicist called Alice Kober, who had died of cancer in 1950 before she could finish Kober, who had spent more than a decade making index cards of every sign in every inscription, working out which signs were inflected endings and which were stems, who had built the statistical scaffold without which what came next would not have been possible. Ventris finally cracks the script. He cracks Linear B, the later of the two scripts at Knossos, the script that had appeared at the palace after the fires of 1450 and that had run the administration in the last centuries of the palatial world. He demonstrates, in a BBC radio broadcast and in a co-authored paper with John Chadwick the following year, that the language of those tablets is not Minoan at all. The language of Linear B is Greek, an archaic form of Greek, 500 years older than Homer, but unmistakably Greek. The whole field of Aegean prehistory tilts in a single afternoon. The men who had been running Knossos in its last centuries were not the people who had built it. The bureaucrats pressing wedges into wet clay in the throne room with the gypsum bench were Mycenaeans. The tablets that Evans had assumed were the ledgers of a great native Minoan empire, were the ledgers of an occupation. The decipherment is exact and beautiful and is one of the most rigorous intellectual achievements of the 20th century. Ventris dies in a car accident in 1956 at the age of 34, and you can decide for yourself what you think about that. But Linear B is not Linear A, and Linear A is the older script. Linear A is the script that runs the palaces in their long noon, the script the priestess at Zakros is using to count saffron, the script that is pressed into clay on offering tables at peak sanctuaries above the clouds. We have, at the latest count, about 1,500 inscriptions in Linear A. We have, by the most careful catalogue, around 90 distinct signs. We have done everything you can do with a corpus of that size. We have applied every cryptographic technique. We have compared it to every known language family. We have run it through the same statistical machinery that broke Linear B and the Mayan glyphs and the Hittite cuneiform. And Linear A does not yield. The language behind it has no living relatives we can find. It has no obvious cousins among the Anatolian languages, none among the Semitic, none among the Indo-European. It seems to be its own thing, alone, a small flower of human speech that grew on one island and was lost when the last mouth that spoke it closed. This is the spine of it. This is the thing the whole telling has been circling back to, in chunk after chunk, for as long as you have been lying here. The civilization we cannot name. The shopping lists that you can almost read. The face on the wall that watches you in the candlelight of the museum case and does not, in any language you own, say its own name. And so you come back to the wet clay. The clay was still soft, in some morning in the 17th century before the Common Era, when a scribe at Knossos took up a sharpened length of reed and pressed into it the count of so many jars of olive oil, the tally of so many sheep, the offering for some festival on the calendar of a religion whose holy days are gone. The clay was still soft when the fire came. The fire baked the clay. The fire that destroyed the palace preserved the tablet. The tablet sat in the rubble for 3,400 years. The tablet sits now in the Heraclean Museum, a few kilometers from the hill on which the priestess once climbed. You can stand in front of the glass case. You can look at it. You can see, with the oblique museum light raking across the surface, the individual marks the reed made in the wet clay. They are as fresh as the morning they were pressed. They are as fresh now, to your eye, as they were then. They are a letter from a hand that knew exactly what it was writing. You can count the symbols. You cannot read the letter. You have the receipts. You do not have the conversations. You know what they ate, and what they wore, and where they made their offerings, and who they buried with what bronze. You do not know what a Minoan mother said to her child, in their own tongue, when the dark came. You do not know what they called the sea. You do not know what they called themselves. They left us everything but their name. The clay still holds the reed's impression. We count their oil. We cannot say it. The sea keeps the rest.